The city was slowly sinking into the evening twilight. The sun slipped behind the horizon, casting a soft light over the streets and leaving behind shadows of houses and trees. This neighborhood, once full of life and the noise of people, had grown silent and empty as night approached. The occasional passing cars hummed softly, and only the sound of the wind sweeping debris along the sidewalk reminded anyone that the city was still alive. On the corner of the street, between two old, shabby buildings, stood a small boy. His slender figure was almost invisible among the massive brick walls. He stood motionless, hugging himself as if trying to keep warm, though the evening wasn't particularly cold. The boy couldn't have been more than 10, but there was something older, wiser in his eyes. It was a gaze where fear and despair intertwined. Jaden, his name was Jaden, had long since ceased to be the typical child playing in the streets with his peers. Everything had changed when his life was split into before and after. Before was a world where his mother, Rebecca, tucked him into bed every night, hugging him and telling him stories. Before was a world where his father, Michael, was a caring and hard-working man, coming home from work, tired, but always ready to smile at his son. But that world was gone, and now there was only after, a dark, heavy time when fear filled his home. The last 2 months had seemed like an eternity for Jaden. He remembered the evening when everything changed. His father came home late, irritable, more nervous than usual. He had bouts of anger, but that night it was something different. Jaden couldn't understand what had happened, but he knew for sure it was the beginning of something terrible. That night, he heard a loud scream from the kitchen and then the sound of the basement door slamming. He wanted to run there to call out for his mother, but his legs froze in place. He was paralyzed by fear. Since then, Rebecca hadn't come out of the basement. Jaden had tried several times to approach the door, calling for her, but the only response was a muffled rustling and the heavy breathing of his father behind him. His father told him everything was fine, that his mother was just sick and needed to stay downstairs to recover. But Jaden knew it was a lie. He couldn't believe his mother would willingly stay in the basement for 2 months, and with each passing day his fear grew stronger. Michael, Jaden's father, had changed. He no longer left the house, didn't go to work. His eyes were bloodshot, and Jaden could no longer recognize the man he had once loved. His father had become cruel, harsh. Any attempt to ask about his mother or approach the basement door ended in yelling and threats. Jaden began to notice that his father spent long hours in the basement, and when he came back up, he looked even gloomier and more withdrawn. The boy became afraid even to breathe near him. Every day after school, he returned home, trying to move as quietly as possible, not to attract attention. He no longer heard his mother's voice, no longer saw her in the house. His whole life had turned into one big mystery, one he couldn't fight against. But one cold autumn evening, Jaden realized he couldn't stay silent any longer. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, listening as his father went down into the basement again. The boy's heart pounded so loudly it seemed his father could hear it through several walls. He remembered his mother's words, ones she had often told him. "You must always tell the truth, Jaden, even if it's scary. The truth always wins." And so, Jaden made a decision that would change his life forever. He knew he had to find help, but who would believe a little boy? Who would come to his aid? Jaden feared that his father would discover his plan, and the punishment for that would be terrifying. But the fear for his mother, who had been locked away for 2 months, was stronger. He quietly got out of bed, trying not to make a sound. The warm glow of the streetlights filled the room, casting long shadows on the walls. Taking his old school backpack, Jaden left the house, carefully closing the door behind him. The street greeted him with the coolness of the night. He didn't know where to go, but he knew one thing. He needed to find a police officer he could trust. As he walked along the sidewalk, Jaden felt the fear slowly give way to resolve. He couldn't stay silent any longer. For 2 months, this fear had washed over him like a wave, but now he knew what he had to do. The city was deserted, which only added to the loneliness in his small heart. Cars passed by, but no one paid attention to him. Finally, after a few blocks, he saw a police car. It was parked by the curb, illuminated by the dim light of a street lamp. Inside sat an officer, seemingly occupied with checking documents. Jaden's heart began to race faster. This was his chance. He slowed his pace, then stopped a few meters away from the car, looking at the officer through the open door. He hesitated for a long time, battling his inner fear and doubts. What if the policeman didn't believe him? What if he sent him home and his father found out? But Jaden remembered his mother's words, her voice in his head. This was his last chance. He took a deep breath and stepped closer. Jaden stood a few meters away from the police car, his small hands trembling with tension. He looked at the officer, trying to convince himself that this man could help, that he would believe him. Every moment seemed like an eternity, with dozens of questions spinning in Jaden's mind. How to start the conversation, what to say, how to explain what was happening at home without being dismissed? After all, this wasn't a typical situation, and Jaden knew he needed to choose his words carefully. Finally, gathering all his courage, Jaden approached the police car. Officer Johnson, a seasoned sergeant, noticed the boy's approach. He was a middle-aged man with experienced, attentive eyes that had seen all kinds of scenes in the city, everything from petty crimes to serious offenses. At first, he thought the child was just lost or that something minor had happened in the area. He opened the car door and crouched down to be at eye level with the boy. "Hey there, kid. Are you all right? Did you get lost?" Johnson asked in a calm, friendly tone, trying not to scare the boy. But Jaden didn't answer right away. He stood there, eyes lowered, struggling to find the words he had rehearsed so many times on his way here. His voice wavered with tension. He needed to say what he had been holding in for the past 2 months. The boy tried several times to start, but each time his tongue seemed to stick to the roof of his mouth, preventing him from speaking. "My mom," he finally muttered, barely audible, as if he couldn't believe he was saying it out loud. The officer frowned. The boy seemed too confused and frightened for it to be a simple conversation. Johnson looked at him closely. There was something in those big, dark eyes that made him suspicious. He had seen children like this before, children who had gone through something terrible but couldn't or were too scared to talk about it. His instincts, honed by years in law enforcement, told him that this simple statement held much more behind it than just a lost mom. "What's wrong with your mom?" Johnson asked, crouching down lower to be at Jaden's level, his voice soft, not wanting to scare the boy further. Jaden took a deep breath. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of his chest. He knew that after these words nothing would be the same, but he couldn't live in fear and waiting any longer. His mom had always told him to tell the truth, no matter how scary it was. "She's in the basement," he said quietly, but the weight of everything he'd experienced over the last 2 months was evident in his words. "She's been there 2 months. Those two words, "in the basement," echoed in the officer's ears. Johnson immediately sensed that the situation was far more serious than it had first seemed. The boy wasn't just lost or looking for his mom. He was telling a story of something terrible, something that couldn't happen in a normal household. Images of what might have been going on began forming in Johnson's mind. Perhaps Jaden's mother was in danger, maybe even being held against her will. These thoughts spurred him to act quickly. A chill ran down the officer's spine as he rose to his feet. He grabbed his radio, and his voice became more serious and assured than it had been just minutes earlier. "Central, this is Sergeant Johnson. I need backup at 12 Baker Street. Urgent. Possible unlawful confinement. I repeat, possible unlawful confinement. Send a team immediately." Jaden stood by, trying to understand what would happen next. His hands were still trembling, but for the first time in a long time, a sense of relief washed over him. He had taken a step toward the truth, and now he hoped that help would finally come. As Officer Johnson called for backup, Jaden felt a strange mix of relief and fear. He knew he had done the right thing by asking for help, but as soon as the radio went quiet and the officer looked back at him, doubt crept in. He began to wonder what would happen next. What would happen to his father? What would the neighbors think when they saw police at their house? And what would his mother say when she found out he had gone to the police? Jaden loved his father, or at least he loved the man Michael used to be. He remembered how his father would take him to football games, tell bedtime stories, and how they would laugh and enjoy every day together. But the man who had been in the house for the past few months was different. His father had changed. It was more than just anger or irritation. Jaden couldn't explain it in words, but he felt it deep inside. And this new father, the one who had kept his mother locked in the basement, terrified him. But despite all of this, Jaden couldn't shake the doubt. He stood on the edge between fear and hope. Part of him wanted to go back home, tell the officers everything was fine, that it was a mistake. He could picture his father becoming the man he used to be. Maybe it was just a temporary difficulty and everything would go back to normal. Maybe if Jaden had just waited a little longer, his mother would have come out of the basement and things would have gone back to the way they were. But another part of him knew that wasn't possible anymore. The time for waiting was over. Every day he didn't act was another day his mother stayed in that basement. He had seen the pain and fear in her eyes the last time she had briefly peeked out of the door, but before his father slammed it shut. Jaden realized no one would help if he didn't take the first step. This inner conflict tore him apart. He felt like a traitor for going against his father, but he knew he had to do it for his mother. This moment of decision was one of the hardest of his life. As he looked back at the house where his childhood had passed, Jaden realized that his childhood was over. What had once been a place of safety and love had now turned into a prison for his mother and for him. When the police cars began arriving at the scene, the boy felt his inner world crumbling. In the distance, blue and red lights flickered, the sound of sirens growing louder, and Jaden knew there was no turning back. The sirens pierced the night silence, and one by one, the police cars stopped in front of Jaden's house. Red and blue lights reflected off the windows, as if signaling to the world that justice had arrived. Jaden stood next to Sergeant Johnson, watching the officers move into action. It all felt like it was happening in slow motion. The car doors slamming, officers moving with precision, someone speaking into a radio, others preparing to enter the house. Sergeant Johnson approached Jaden and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did well," the officer said quietly. "Everything will be all right." Jaden nodded, but his heart was still gripped by fear. He watched as the police officers moved toward the house. For the first time, the reality of the situation hit him with full force. They were about to go inside. They would find his father. And what would happen next? Jaden was torn between conflicting emotions, fear for what would happen to his family, and relief that the nightmare might finally be coming to an end. The officers knocked on the door, but there was no answer. They exchanged glances, and then one of them, a tall, sturdy man, said, "We're going in." They broke down the door and rushed inside. Jaden couldn't see what was happening behind the closed door, but he could hear the commotion, footsteps, loud voices, orders being shouted. Something important was happening inside, and Jaden knew that the fate of his family was being decided at that moment. Several long minutes passed before the officers came out with his father. Michael was in handcuffs, his face twisted with rage and despair. He was shouting something, but Jaden couldn't make out the words. His father wouldn't look at him, as if Jaden had ceased to exist the moment he called the police. All the boy felt at that moment was a cold emptiness. This was not the man he remembered, and not the one he had feared for the past months. "Jaden," the officer next to him said quietly, "it's better if you don't watch." But Jaden couldn't look away. He watched as his father was led to the police car, understanding that this was the end. His father had made his choices, and now he had to face the consequences. When the house was finally secured, one of the officers went to the basement and opened the door. The smell of dampness and neglect hit them as soon as it opened. Then, on the stairs, Jaden saw his mother, Rebecca. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and a pale face, but there was a glow of relief in her eyes. She slowly climbed up, and when she saw her son, she managed a weak smile, her lips trembling. "Jaden!" Her voice was soft but filled with warmth and gratitude. She rushed to him and embraced him tightly, as if afraid that if she let go, he would disappear. Jaden felt her arms shaking, but it was the warmest hug he had ever known. He knew he had done the right thing, and that hug was his reward for all the pain and fear he had endured. The officers finished their work, filled out their reports, and slowly began to leave the scene. Michael was taken to the police station, and Rebecca and Jaden were left alone, embracing outside the house. Jaden still felt the weight of the world shifting around him. Their lives would never be the same, but at least now they were free. Justice had been served. After the police left, the house became incredibly quiet. But this silence was different from the one Jaden had grown used to over the past 2 months. It was no longer filled with fear. It was a silence of relief. A silence where there were no longer the shouts of his father or the sound of his footsteps on the creaking stairs. For the first time in a long while, Jaden felt free. Rebecca, his mother, held his hand as they sat on the porch of the house. She looked worn out, but her face showed gratitude and quiet joy. The officers had told her before they left that she and her son were now under protection, that Michael would be held accountable for his actions, and that they no longer had to live in fear. Jaden's story, and the story of his family, is not just an isolated incident. It reflects the reality of many families who live in fear, suffering from domestic violence and control. Domestic abuse often remains hidden behind closed doors, and unfortunately, many victims are too afraid to seek help. The fear of judgment, disbelief, or retaliation keeps them trapped, often in isolation, just as Rebecca had been. Despite his young age, Jaden found the strength to do the right thing. He was the one who exposed the terrible truth, despite his fear of his father, the potential consequences, and the doubts that tormented him. This story highlights the importance of courage and truth, even in the face of fear and pressure. There is always a chance to change your fate if you make the right choice. Society must pay attention to such stories. Support and care for those in need can save lives. It's important not to remain indifferent to those who suffer from abuse, whether physical or psychological. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places, and in this story, young Jaden became the one who brought justice to their home. Jaden's story is one of hope and a fight for justice. a story of how one brave step can change everything. Now, he knew that even in the darkest moments, there is always light to be found, and that fighting for truth and justice is always worth it.